Do you enjoy books that make you rethink how the modern world works and you're just curious about resource allocations and the challenges that we face in this modern world? If so, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing Material World by Ed Conway. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're diving deep into the hidden world of raw materials, supply chains, and how they shape our lives. This book, Material World by Ed Conway, is a fascinating exploration of the raw materials that underpin modern life. When you think about the materials in your smartphone, the concrete in your city, or even the cobalt in your electric car battery, Conway takes us on a journey to discover where these things come from, how they're extracted, and the often invisible human and environmental costs behind them. The author structures the book around 6 key materials that define modern civilization. You have sand, salt, copper, oil, iron, and lithium, which are all the key focuses of this book and the things that he uses to tell a lot of interesting stories. And so each chapter delves into one of these materials and it uncovers its history, its industrial uses, and of course the global impact of its extraction. So for example, in the chapter on sand, Conway explains how this seemingly mundane material is the backbone of urbanization. From skyscrapers to glass, sand is essential, yet its extraction has led to environmental devastation and even violent sand mafias in some parts of the world. And even though you might think, well, there's a lot of sand in the world, how could this be an issue? You will soon discover that for all of these different things that you need sand, such as glass or concrete, most famously concrete, you actually need a very particular type of sand, and so it has to be mined somewhere. And so all of these things are things that you probably haven't considered that have really affected various parts of the world, especially the places that have the sand that can be mined, but as well as the places that are using that sand. Probably the most famous example of that in recent history would be China. China has had a major demand on sand for its massive construction projects. Another one, the copper chapter, takes readers to the vast mines of Chile, where copper is extracted on an almost unimaginable scale. Copper is essential for wiring and electronics and renewable energy infrastructure, but its extraction leaves behind massive scars on the landscape, and it raises questions about the sustainability of its increasing demand. And as we think about alternative energy and we think of all the things necessary for building batteries and our electronics, we have to face the fact that it does take a particular toll. Another one is, of course, oil, which we have had many a focus on oil. So this one, although he certainly has some new things to say, there's also going to be a lot of stuff that I think you should already be pretty familiar with. In his focus on oil, he highlights the central role that it has played not just in energy, but also in manufacturing countless products that we use daily, pretty much anything made of plastic. And of course, this is going to touch upon all of the geopolitical struggles that are tied to oil and the complex web of dependencies that it has created. His look at lithium and rare earth metals are crucial for batteries and green technologies that reveal a sobering paradox. While these materials are marketed as the future of clean energy, their extraction often involves destructive mining practices and exploitative labor conditions in countries like Bolivia and China. And Conway's vivid descriptions of lithium salt flats and rare earth processing plants gives reader a clear picture of the challenges ahead as the world transitions to renewable energies. And his look at iron, which of course is another staple of industrialization, really comes to life through Conway's exploration of steel production and its importance to infrastructure. He connects the dots between the skyscrapers of modern cities and the vast iron ore mines in Australia and Brazil that make them possible, as well as places where the legacy of iron mining and steelmaking, such as in the United States, particularly in Pennsylvania, thinking of Pittsburgh, and even recently in the United States, as we've had discussions of selling off US steel. All of that can help you see why this discussion of iron is not only important for understanding the infrastructure and the supply chains, but understanding modern politics. This is a really interesting read. I love these types of books. I think in the last year I've read probably half a dozen to a dozen of them where it looks at the history of the world through a specific thing, something like beverages, or it takes a look at materials that you may not think are necessarily all that important, and you try to explore how they are much more important than you think. Another example of that might be a history of salt that I've read in the last few years. These are fascinating ways to look at the world. Now, I do think in many ways their premise is slightly flawed, and that is that they're just taking one element. And so to say that these are the most important materials could be a bit of a challenge, because you could also just as easily pick another 6 things that you say, no, if I focus on these, you could also tell a story about how these are shaping the modern world. So to say any kind of exclusivity on any of these minerals or elements, I would say that's probably leading you in the wrong direction. But if you're understanding this in a more total and a more complete sense, I think that there's a lot to get out of a book like this. And I found that Conway really has a way of just taking complex topics, and I think he does break them down quite well. In many regards, I thought it was beautifully done. And so you don't need any kind of like background in geology or economics to follow along in a book of this nature. And I would say that his storytelling brings all of these mines and factories and even these questions of supply chains to life. And I certainly enjoyed that. And of course, the global perspective was absolutely fascinating. So the book scope, I mean, it is vast. It covers industries and locations around the world. And as you're talking about stuff, you know, from rare earth metals that are being mined in China to the oil sands of Canada, I think that he is touching upon pretty much every region of the world in a way that shows you how so many different things are interconnected, and I just think that that's really valuable. Also has that human touch, and so Conway centers on people behind these different industries. So he's also talking about the miners and the engineers and the factory workers and their lives and their struggles, and all those things I think make this just a little more relatable and gives it that really important human touch, considering you are talking about so many innate objects that inherently in many regards have no specific value. It's how they're being used that gives them value. And so of course connecting that to the lives that are affected by them, especially the extraction and the manufacturing, the production of them, I think those things help to really make this all the more poignant of a book that should appeal to anyone that is interested in questions about our modern systems and our ever increasing interconnected economies. So who would I say this book is for? Well, I really enjoyed it. I will say, because he takes 6 things, that is casting a pretty wide net. And so any one of these things, I'm sure you could find a separate book that is going to go into more details about it and give you an even better understanding of how that has played an impact on the modern economy and on modern life. However, I will say that they probably won't necessarily be as readable, because regardless of the scope, the fact that he makes this so readable is one of the things that I think gives it a big plus. So I would say that this is for anybody that is interested in getting just this human level as well as this macro level understanding of some of the most important materials that make up the complexities of the economies in which we live. I would say that this is also for anyone that just enjoys that journalistic style of telling about such large themes. I think if you wanted, you could approach any of these things in a much more academic and probably a much less appealing approach that might make it a little harder for people to really appreciate. But by and large, I think that most people would find it very easy to follow along and find it enjoyable, especially the stories that he chooses to tell. Who is this not for? Well, if you are looking for something a little more focused, or if you want to have a little bit more of a case study on any of these things individually, this is not for you. I think he is pretty committed, even though he has that human element, I think he's pretty committed to also making sure you understand how it connects to the whole world. And I think that as appealing as it can be, it's also not necessarily what everyone is looking for when they're trying to study these various things, especially when they look at supply chains or when they look at modern economy. Some people want a much more focused and much more detailed conversation about these things. And I would say that it may not appeal to people that are looking for those types of things. But I would love to know your guys' thoughts on this book in particular, but I would also like to know if you guys have any other suggestions for books of this nature. Please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.